Hello AP World History students. Happy snow day, first of all. And now we have a reckoning. Because our endpoint is May 17th, we've got to keep moving forward. So we're going to do a flip video lesson. This is going to be a flip lesson instead of a jigsaw presentation. Some of you might feel all right about that. The overall topic is how World War I was concluded and some outcomes from it, most of which are unsatisfactory. So the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that officially ends the war. It is a compromised document, you could say. It's a strange compromise between the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who is a progressive style idealist who wants to kind of, proclaim this a war to end all wars and create a new near utopian world order, and the old, crusty, entrenched representatives of Britain and France who are interested in kind of looking after their own business and their own interests and their own territory. So Woodrow Wilson, is kind of not quite a usurper, but he walks into this treaty in a funny position. The United States had entered the war very late. We played an important part, but he kind of had announced already before he got there. He pronounces these 14 points, like this is what I will be going into a peace treaty looking to get, and things like open diplomacy, freedom on the seas, military restrictions, sort of like military drawbacks. We're going to let all these small people groups in anywhere around the world, but in places like Southeast Europe, we're going to let them have self-determination, rule themselves, so we won't have these kind of like multi-ethnic powder kegs like the Austro-Hungarian Empire anymore. And the big one is, he says, and we're going to have a League of Nations that's going to be able to prevent a smallish crisis like what happened in 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke, and prevent that from escalating into a full-scale war again. So he shows up with this big list of demands. And Clemenceau of France and Lloyd George of Britain, are sort of like, all right, that's interesting. We'll take that under advisement. Thank you very much. In the meantime, their objectives are to kind of put their boot on Germany. So they are going to insist on heavy penalties for Germany, and that will make its way into the treaty. They insert this language called the war guilt clause. And Germany is in a position of, well, either we can go back to fighting, and you're not going to like that, especially because Germany has really weakened badly in the months since the armistice. We can go back to fighting, or you can sign this clause here, this treaty, which insists that the entire war is your fault. And because it's all your fault, Germany, you must pay reparations payments to the rest of us. Basically, you have to pay us back for the war. And we'll get back to you on how much that costs. And in the end, that number was north of $30 billion. And that's just silly money. And the whole point of it was to punish Germany, especially from France's perspective, to make sure that Germany was not going to be a rival to them on the continent. Wilson is frustrated by this. And in the end, he ends up getting some of what he wants, but even that's going to be compromised, as we'll see. When you look at this map, the things that you'll notice is that, first of all, the Austro-Hungarian Empire has been dismantled in this Treaty of Versailles. In some ways along the lines of that self-determination idea, but that not in a completely coherent way. But we now see all kinds of smaller nations in southeastern Europe. We see that there's no more Ottoman Empire. We'll talk about that in a moment. We can see that Germany has shrunk. Germany has lost territory to Russia. Poland has been recreated, and Germany also has lost some territory to France. This treaty is so harsh on Germany that it creates an almost inevitable backlash. So there's this democratic government that's established in Germany in the wake of the war. The Kaiser is gone. The Weimar Republic is the name of this democracy. It is it never really reaches full strength as a government. It's crippled by all kinds of problems. And one of the problems that this Weimar Republic had is that at the insistence of the Allies, the first order of business of the Weimar Republic is to put its name on the Treaty of Versailles, which the German public roundly resents. And so it's just sort of like from its inception, this new government in Germany didn't stand much of a chance. And it will limp its way through the 1920s and give way in the 1930s to dictatorship. England and France were particularly interested in the question of Germany's colonial possessions and what will become of them. And in some cases, they said, well, those places, we'll just scoop them up ourselves. All right. In some cases, though, they sort of took this high-minded language of saying, well, some parts of Germany's old colonial territories, or certainly the Ottoman holdings in the Middle East, we're going to keep these as mandates. And a mandate is not quite a colony, but it sounds a lot like a colony. The idea is, well, you see, Jordan or Iraq or Palestine, you aren't quite ready to be an independent country on your own yet. You're not one of the big boys yet, but we're going to keep you as a mandate, and we will help you, and we will sort of like groom you for independence at some future date. And this was infuriating to Arabs in the Middle East, in all these parts of the Middle East, because they said, we fought with you, the Allies. We fought against the Ottomans under the assumption that you led us to believe that at the other end of this fight is going to be independence for us. And now, once we've won the war, you seem to be reneging or changing the terms of the deal. And it's hard to blame them for feeling outraged. And Britain and France, again, sort of had this language of, well, we're afraid that it would just sort of turn into, internal warfare in the Middle East. And they might have been right about that. But it's not a great look. One of the questions that pops up here is this issue of Zionism or a Jewish homeland. Now we read about that. That's been kind of percolating below the surface for a while in the late 19th century, and it really comes up here. And for the British who claim this mandate, the mandate of Palestine, that little sliver of land there on the Eastern Mediterranean, they're immediately besieged by Zionist interests, Jews who say, well, can we make this happen? Can under your guidance, under your leadership, can we make this happen? And Britain announces this Balfour Declaration that says, yeah, it's our intention to create a Jewish homeland, and that creates a lot of consternation or anger, or further feelings of backstabbing from Arabs living in the area. When you look at this map of what the of what is created in the wake of World War I, we see these new countries here. This had all just once been Ottoman territory, but a country like Iraq and Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, these are all new creations. Some of them don't make a lot of sense. We have some arbitrary borders, like what happened with Africa. This is particularly the case with Iraq, in which, like, if you look along the Iranian border, that's a Shiite majority group over there. On the western side, it's Sunni majority, and toward the north you have Kurds. It's a different ethnic group. Many of them are Christian. It's a hodgepodge. It's not well designed or well conceived as a country. And as you know, the history of just even the last 30, 40 years in Iraq is war-torn internal strife, in part because it's a misbegotten country. So the League of Nations. President Wilson had come in with this big list of demands. He got some of them, but sort of only after Britain and France and kind of insisted on getting what they wanted first. But they did throw in this League of Nations. And to Wilson, this was, Wilson recognized this is a compromise treaty, but I got my League of Nations. That's the biggest idea that I want. And this is the piece that's the key piece to preventing wars like this in the future. The irony is that the League of Nations fails. And the reason that the League of Nations failed is that the United States didn't enter the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson returns home with the treaty, But there's this bit of constitutional business in the United States where the United States Senate has to approve any treaty that the United States enters into. And the United States Senate was in an isolationist mood. The United States Senate was concerned that some of the language in the League of Nations mandate said that like nations that are in the League are going to be bound to mutual defense. And to many, especially many Republicans in the United States Senate, they said, hold on, does that mean like if Yugoslavia gets invaded in the future that we, the United States, are going to be bound to this? Why should we do this? Why should we let any other sort of supranational body determine whether we go to war or not? And they just didn't sign off on it. And so without the United States in the League of Nations, the Soviet Union was never in the League of Nations. There's some significant countries that aren't in it, and so it's just kind of crippled from the outset. And when the crises of the 1930s arrived, the League of Nations isn't equipped to deal with it. Randomly awful things to add on to the World War I story. One is a genocide, the first of the really awful 20th century genocides. This is in the Ottoman Empire. And so there's this, the Ottoman Empire is ruled by ethnic Turks. And there's a process of, I guess you could call it ethnic cleansing, in which they were going after particular ethnic groups that they saw as problematic within their empire. And like the conflagration, World War I happening provides, I guess, some cover or excuse for them to really go after the Armenians in particular. And so it's hard to say. The number seems to be north of 2 million. Just suffice it to say, it's really a grim and awful story. Turkey, the country that, like, the Ottoman Empire is dismantled. Turkey sort of emerges in its wake as a somewhat healthy state in the 1920s. But Turkey, to this day, doesn't acknowledge that this happened. It basically says, that's war. There's like a bunch of really gross stuff that goes on, and it's just kind of one of these ugly things. But war is war, and this wasn't a genocide, and so there's this kind of dance. Like, Turkey is ostensibly anyway an ally of the United States, and American presidents are kind of very hesitant to use this word genocide with regard to what happened. And it might sound silly because we're talking about something that happened now more than 100 years ago, but it is a very real diplomatic thing between the United States and Turkey, which is again kind of ostensibly a Muslim ally nation that, like, well, what are we going to call this thing that you guys did that long ago? On top of that, you have this insanely awful biological phenomenon of influenza epidemic. The influenza epidemic of 1918, not the influence pandemic. That sounds sort of more positive, I don't know. But influenza, or they used to call it Spanish flu, but it's just an insanely terrible flu outbreak that kills more people than the entire war killed. And it just sort of like drops right as the war is ending. And it infects nearly a third of the world's population and kills between 20 and 50 million. It hit here in the United States. It's especially devastating in the Pacific. There was no cure for it. In the United States, what it looked like is huge school gymnasiums just be turned into these hospitals where they just lay out cots and try to help people. But it's incredibly grim. And it fuels some of the pessimism and the cynicism that we're going to see in the next flip video lesson, 6.3, like the sort of period of just a sense of like, where has modern progress got us? It has not gotten us anywhere good. So anyway, there's our snow day flip video lesson for you. Thank you. Have a great day. See ya.